And we've been working our way through Matthew's gospel, and we'll spend a few more weeks finishing that up in the weeks prior to Easter. But because of that, I want to just get us a little bit of a refresher, because it's been a while since we've stepped into that world of Matthew and his story of the life and times of Jesus Christ and what he saw from his perspective of Jesus' life. And first of all, the way that Matthew organizes this book, Jesus is presented as this coming king. And his way of life that he's teaching is presented as a whole different kingdom. And it operates in very different ways than people in and of their own natural tendencies work. And so not only is that something that is a trait of Jesus, but as people start to follow Jesus, the way that they live life and the kingdom, if you will, that they are a part of, even during their time here on earth, and the priorities that they have become totally different, and they stand out. And to some people, it's immensely attractive, and to other people, they don't want to have anything to do with it. And it really tends to divide people because it's very contrary to the way that this world works. And so all throughout Matthew, it's like you're getting this puzzle that's coming together. And at the end of it, you see something like what you would see on the screen here of Jesus and this kingdom of followers and people. But you're getting bits and pieces in every chapter and in different verses of Matthew's portrait, or Matthew's mosaic, maybe, of what this king and this different type of kingdom look like. And so that's what we're jumping into. We're jumping into the end part of the book. There's 5 different main speeches or discussions or conversations or sermons throughout this book, and they all speak about a different aspect of Jesus' kingdom. And one of the last speeches, the final one in the book, we talked about prior to Thanksgiving, and that was where Jesus... he's talking with some of the Jewish religious leaders and political leaders in Jerusalem. And he's pointing out all the differences in their priorities, how their priorities are in conflict with God's priorities. And then the world, he broadens out to looking at the world and how the world and the way that it's headed and the conflicts that it has, those are also opposed to the way that his kingdom works. And so whether it's leadership and religious leaders on a local level, or whether you expand it out and you look at things worldwide, people have these tendencies, and they're in a polar opposite direction from where Jesus and his kingdom is heading. And now he's going to show us some examples of that in the way people act, in the way people react. Some of it are the religious leaders in Jerusalem and the political leaders in Jerusalem, and some of it's going to be Jesus' own followers. And from this, we get a little bit of a wake-up call, because just because you think and I think that we're following Jesus doesn't mean that we truly are in different aspects. We all have things to learn. We all have things to evaluate about ourselves. And so we'll get into that in our discussion this morning. My tendency has become to involve you all in some of the conversation. And so I definitely have some questions for us to dialogue through and discuss this morning. And so I'd invite your ideas and your thoughts and your comments. Please share. That's how we grow together. We get different perspectives and we kind of mix them all together in the pot. It's going to help us get a better understanding of this. But just to kind of walk us into the situation, I want to give you a couple of verses. This is Matthew 26, and we're starting out at the beginning of the chapter. There's only 28 chapters in the book, so like I said, we're almost near the end. And it says, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, those conversations with religious leaders, political leaders, his own followers about how the world's headed in a different direction, and even some of the local religious and political leaders are headed in a totally different direction, different priorities in Jesus' kingdom. Right on the tail end of those things, he tells his disciples, specifically the 12 that are his closest, maybe some other ones that are around or in the room as well. He says, Passover takes place after 2 more days. And the Son of Man, most translations say, you could also translate it, the Son of Human, he's going to be handed over to be crucified. And the Son of Man is the title Jesus has been using to talk about himself. So these are kind of some ominous words as this puzzle comes together. And so I have some questions on the screen I want to throw out. We're not going to camp out on any one of these for an extended period of time, but I just want to know your thoughts. What do you think? Why do you think Matthew at this point mentions Passover and mentions the Son of Human, or Son of Man, being handed over to be crucified? Any thoughts of why we get that comment in the narrative at this point? Why is Passover significant to this conversation? What do you think? Does it have anything to do with where this story is headed? I see some people shaking their heads. Why would Passover be mentioned here? What do you think? A symbol. Okay, a symbol of what? Christ's death. Okay, so we have to go back to the Old Testament a little bit. Passover was something that happened with Moses and Israel when they were enslaved by Egypt, somewhere around maybe 1400s BC. And God, through a series of events, convinced Pharaoh that he needed to let these people, these Israelites, go out into the wilderness. And throughout that whole process, there was this event called Passover. And it was one of the final signs that God did to convince Egypt to let these people go, where God said, if you want to protect your firstborn sons in your homes, then you're going to take a lamb that doesn't have any blemishes. You're going to kill it at twilight. You're going to put its blood on the doorposts around your home. And that night, the messenger of death will pass by your house, and your son will be spared. Your firstborn son will be spared. But for any house that doesn't follow that, their firstborn son will face death that night. And so you said a sign or a symbol. So maybe there's something about what's coming ahead for Jesus, and there's something about the significance of that lamb that was sacrificed and its blood, and how its blood spared the life of the firstborn child. And maybe Jesus and his death and his blood is going to do something similar in a different way. So maybe we need to have that on our radar. And Matthew's going to talk about that in more detail in the next couple chapters. The Son of Man, that's also an interesting title because it's used all over the Old Testament in different places. In Ezekiel, it's used to talk about the humiliating circumstances that Ezekiel's put in over and over and over again. Like this guy, some of these Old Testament prophet figures go through more humiliating circumstances than anyone you could ever possibly write a story about in life. And so that has to do with the humiliation and the humility. But it also is from a passage in Daniel chapter 7. And this is on the other end of the spectrum. Because Daniel, he's seeing these visions or having these dreams. And he says, I kept watching these dreams, and I saw 2 thrones that were set in place. And the Ancient of Days, so think about the one with no beginning and end. He's talking about God himself here, took his seat on one of the thrones. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was like white as wool, and his throne seat, it was flaming like fire, and its wheels were blazing fire. You think, well, that's weird, a throne with wheels? What is that? I think it's more of a chariot throne, because in ancient times, the kings would parade through towns and villages. They'd have a seat in their royal chariot. And so the Ancient of Days is taking a seat in the royal chariot, but there's this empty seat next to the Ancient of Days. And Daniel keeps dreaming, and he says, suddenly one like a son of human, or a son of man, was coming with the clouds of heaven. That's another phrase that the Bible only uses to refer to God himself, is somebody coming on the clouds of heaven. So it's interesting that a son of a human would be depicted in Daniel's dream as coming on the clouds of heaven like God himself. Then it says he approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He was given a kingdom that people of every ethnicity and language, nation should serve him. And this was a kingdom that would never be destroyed. So he takes a seat next to the Ancient of Days in the royal chariot. And he's depicted as being ushered in like God himself. And that's an interesting thing. It's really confusing to Daniel. But when Jesus pulls up that phrase, the Son of Man, he's saying, in essence, I'm going to be crucified, but I'm about to inherit a kingdom. I'm about to sit down next to the Ancient of Days, and I'm about to begin ruling in a kingdom that will never end. So there's a lot of implications behind what Jesus is saying here. He's telling his disciples this, but his conversation with the religious leaders and the political leaders in Jerusalem has had a whole different effect. We read about them in the next verses. It says, then the chief priests and the elders of the people in Jerusalem assembled in the courtyard of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus in a treacherous way. Treacherous is like crafty or tricky. If you've heard the word crafty or tricky in the Bible before, other places, you should kind of like connect those instances. They're being crafty, they're being cunning, they're being tricky. And they want to kill Jesus, it says. But they say, not during the festival, so there won't be a riot among the people, because Rome is in control. And if there are riots, Rome's going to come down hard. So we got to be tricky. We got to be crafty about the way that we approach arresting Jesus and killing Jesus. I've got a picture up here next. This is kind of an artist rendition. They discovered a house not far from the temple complex in Jerusalem. Archaeology discovered it a few years ago. And they believe that it's one of the high priest's residence, perhaps the one that we read about in the scriptures where this group of leaders meet to conspire against Jesus. The courtyard area, I put a red circle around in this diagram, but there's actual pictures of some of the other areas of the house. I'll bring that in over the next few weeks as we walk toward the Easter story, because some of the events take place in perhaps this very house, perhaps something very similar in town. But there's a lot of things to indicate that this very luxurious home was the home of the high priest family in Jerusalem. Go on to the next slide real quick here. Why would anybody conspire to kill Jesus? Why would these leaders, if you're just joining us today, obviously you're jumping in the middle of like what's been going on for months. But if you've been with us especially, why would these leaders, why would anybody want to conspire to arrest and kill Jesus? Why? Why would you want to do anything to Jesus? Yes?
They're afraid of his power and they don't want him to take over their positions.
Okay, you threw a lot of things in just a few words right there. You said there's fear, they're afraid, and his power and their positions, there's some conflict there. Anybody else? What do you think? Why would somebody, yes, in the very back.
They're afraid what he teaches is against what they have been living.
Oh, that's convicting, huh? When you've got this person that just won't be quiet and everything they say is against the way that you're living, right? That gets annoying, right? You can't deal with that. Somebody else, yes?
He was beginning to gather people around him that would listen to him, followers.
So he had a following, and maybe that was perceived as a threat too, because he has his followers and people were gathering. And for a while there were a ton of people gathering, and it seems like some of the people left and some of the people are sticking with him, but he's still like seen as somebody who's gathered a following. And just a few days before this, people are grabbing palm branches and hacking him off and waving him before Jesus as he enters into Jerusalem. And so this is like, kind of feels threatening to them and their power, for sure. Yes?
He's teaching against their law.
He's teaching against their law. And I would say he's teaching against the way that they interpret their law. Because they're focused on some things, but the heart of the law, like mercy and justice and compassion, they've kind of let go of. But he is teaching against a lot of their interpretations and a lot of their rules. Yeah, and that becomes, again, a problem for them too. When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking a little bit about a quote that I've heard from different Western movies. There was this movie in 1932. Not that I'm familiar with, 1932 films, but in 1932, there's a movie called The Western Code. And there was a ranch foreman named Nick Grindle. And there was a new lawman in town, and his name was Tim Barrett. And Nick Grindle didn't like the way that Tim Barrett, as a new lawman, was handling things in town. So he came up to him and he said, let me see if you can finish this quote. "This town ain't big enough for the both of us, and I'm going to give you 24 hours to get out of it." And there's an implication there. We can't both coexist in this town because you do things one way and, we do things another. And that was the same attitude that these religious and political leaders in Jerusalem had toward Jesus. His kingdom, his interests were in total conflict with theirs. And again, you touched on a lot of these major issues. I just want to recap a couple of those things. One, Jesus' priorities in the direction of his kingdom and his teachings, his laws, seem to be totally different, especially in the ways, like you said in the back, that the Pharisees were living and the different religious leaders were living at the time. But basically, one group, the Jerusalem leadership, they were all about trying to advantage themselves. How can we benefit as a group? And then Jesus and his followers were all about trying to help the disadvantaged and benefit other people and lift them up and empower them. The religious teachers in Jerusalem were all about adding burdens to people's lives to show how spiritual they could be, how much they could take. And Jesus said, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." He wanted to lighten the load. The leaders, they loved money. And Jesus even addressed that pretty directly when he was speaking with them. And Jesus and his kingdom was all about loving people. the leadership in the city of Jerusalem, they sought honor. Banquets, parties, positions. They wanted the most privileged seats. They wanted everyone to have their attention focused on them. They would dress in specific ways to draw attention. They would live luxurious lives. They wanted to be honored. And yet Jesus and his kind of ragtag bunch of followers, they were okay with a life of humility and sometimes obscurity. One group wanted to look righteous, and the other group actually wanted to live righteous, where they put right relationships with people and God, like actually into practice, kind of what you said, Ron, as well. One attacks disadvantaged people. They take more advantage of them, and one empowers them. One is going to do the same thing that their forefathers did, repeat the same mistakes, and then the other kingdom is going to try to avoid them. One's going to eventually harm God's servants again, and one is going to help God's servants. And so there's these totally different priorities, almost polar opposite in every way. There's anger because, again, Jesus has told some stories, the parables, and these leaders know that Jesus is talking about them. It's not casting them in a good light because it's speaking of them in terms and analogies like fruitless fig trees and a kid who says he'll work for his dad in the vineyard and then says, I'm just going to do whatever I want. And a king who invites people to be guests at the royal wedding banquet, and they say, nah, I'm not interested. I've got better things. And they know Jesus is comparing their apathy to those people. And then there's fear. You know, what's going to happen if we lose power? We approach things in a different way than Jesus does because we try to resist Rome's influence. And Jesus says things like, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give the money that belongs to God. So we don't know what to do with him. He's a threat to the way that we do things. And more people are starting to get interested in him. And if we don't stop this, they're going to follow him and not us. And again, that ends up with what June said, power. Their power is threatened.
Also, Jason, doesn't Jesus state somewhere before this that he is God, but not out and out? And they want to prove that he's not because if they kill him, he's dead. He's not God in their eyes. Is that true or not?
There have been some places, Jesus kind of avoids making outright statements about himself being God, but he drops clues a lot of places. And they're catching in on these things. Like he'll use the term I am, which is the name for the God of the Bible in the Old Testament in reference to himself. And so he's saying it without saying it. Again, I think to prolong what's happening, but eventually they're catching on and they're seeing. And they have a completely different idea about who Jesus is, than Matthew or these gospel writers do, or perhaps even you and I do as well. And these are crafty people at heart, because they're doing this treacherously. Just like that crafty serpent that you meet in the first chapters of the Bible. They have that same heart. And they don't want Rome, again, to clamp down on what they do. So they have to do back channels and night trials and take care of things when most people are asleep and in their own homes to avoid uprising with the people. So that's the way that they approach things and they approach life. And they're very condemning of Jesus. They're very critical. But not Jesus' followers, right? We would never be condemning or critical of people. That's good. So we get another story on the tail end of that. And I think it's meant in part to give us some good examples and in part to cause us to rethink the way that we approach things and just our process, especially when it's related to being critical of each other. And this is a different story. It's in verses 6 to 16 of Matthew 26. So press pause on this little cunning coalition of people plotting Jesus' arrest and death. That's happening in one part of town. And over across the valley on the town of Bethany, about a mile and a half away, something totally different is happening. It's a dinner. It says, Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, and a woman approached him. We know from John's story this woman was Mary, who lived in Bethany. Her sister was Martha, her brother was Lazarus, and we read about them in some of the other stories related to Jesus' life in the area. So a woman named Mary approached him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, a pound of pure spikenard. And we know from other places and from later on in this account that pure spikenard, it's an oil that's imported from India in that area. And so it's very valuable at that time. It's very valuable today. I think today for one of those little doTERRA bottles, it's about this big. You'll pay $75 for some pure spikenard. I actually got one a couple years ago because I was interested in what it would actually smell like. So maybe I'll get another one soon so you can sample it if you've never had that opportunity. But it's a very expensive oil from a plant called the spikenard. And this bottle of oil is worth, in our day, it says 300 days' wages in the story, so think $50,000. It's a $50,000 bottle of perfume. And she breaks it, and she pours it on Jesus' head. She has some extra in the bottle, and we know from the other stories in the other Gospels, she pours some of it on Jesus' feet as well and starts wiping his feet with her hair. But as he's just leaning on the table having this meal, she comes up behind him and pours it on his head. Go to the next slide if you want to. Something like this. So why would Matthew mention a woman pouring $50,000 worth of oil on Jesus' head? What's that have to do with anything? What do you think? What? She's honoring him. No doubt, if I poured $50,000 worth of anything on somebody, I better be honoring them, right? Sure, it's making a statement about how she feels about Jesus and what she's doing to him, definitely. I mean, that's a big sacrifice, right? Let's think about oil and pouring oil on people's heads. Does that ever happen in the Bible anywhere? I mean, nobody does that to me in normal life here in Laverkin, Utah. People don't just come up behind me while I'm eating dinner and pour expensive oil on my head, or cheap oil for that matter. Why is this happening? Why do people pour oil on people's heads in the Bible? Okay. Rosemary said in the Old Testament, a lot of times it was an anointing, so it was more of like a ceremony. Now, what types of people were anointed, like ceremoniously anointed with oil? Okay. Okay, I heard people set apart. I heard kings. I heard priests. Kings and priests. Kings would be like the most numerous. Priests is actually the first occurrence of it being done, and I think there's one prophet who is anointed with oil as well. And so immediately by Matthew sharing this, he's again drawing our little connections in our mind to these instances in the Old Testament that are related to kings beginning their kingship, priests beginning their ministry, prophets beginning their representation of God. And so all this draws our mind toward that. And it's interesting because at those point in times in the Old Testament, a lot of times olive oil was present everywhere throughout their culture. And so that's what was used to do these anointings. But this is not olive oil. This is $50,000 worth of imported oil from India that Mary is pouring over Jesus' head. And I think it's meant to draw our attention toward the fact that this person who is being anointed with this oil is being commissioned as king, and maybe as priest, and maybe as prophet, and maybe all those things apply to Jesus. Have you heard the word Messiah before? Maybe a few times. It's translated with the word Christ in the New Testament. You know what the word Christ and Messiah mean? What do they mean? Anybody remember? The word Christ and the word Messiah mean anointed one, somebody who's had oil poured on them. And so really what this woman Mary is doing, she is making Jesus Messiah. She is anointing him as king. This is a very significant moment. Jesus is the Christ, the anointed one, like it's literal now. Do you know who would take on that role in the Old Testament of anointing kings or priests or prophets with oil? Who would usually do that? June said, not a woman. Women didn't do lots of things in these cultures. It was normally a prophet. God would use a prophet to do this. And so, again, Jesus' kingdom it's shaking things up a little bit. And there were a few female prophets that are mentioned by name in the Old Testament, maybe more. Deborah was a prophetess and also a judge over Israel, a national leader. Huldah was a prophetess. You see people like Anna in the New Testament who are prophetesses, so you know that they existed. But by Mary doing this, like this is a very significant thing. And by Matthew mentioning it, I mean, you would think somebody like John the Baptist would be the person who would be chosen to do this. But it's not. It's this woman that has this heart to honor and worship Jesus in an amazing way with a very extravagant gift who ends up taking on this role. And again, as you mentioned, normally in society at this point in time, it wouldn't have been a woman, but it was. And so what does that tell you about God and the way that his kingdom operates? It's different from the way that people have defaulted throughout the centuries. And it just makes us step back and rethink, what does this action reveal about God and the way of Jesus and Jesus' kingdom? And I think that might be one of the reasons why Matthew mentions it, because Jesus' kingdom operates differently than people do in their own humanity by default. And so, of course, Jesus, very spiritual, 12 followers, his closest disciples, see this happening and they start just praising God and saying, oh, this is amazing. Jesus is being anointed. He is king. He's coming into his kingdom. We're so excited. And then you read the next verse and it's kind of a downer. It says, when the disciples saw it, they were indignant. The word indignant means angry. They were ticked off. Why this waste? It says they interrogated her. You foolish woman, what are you doing pouring a $50,000 vial of perfume on Jesus' head at the dinner table? What are you thinking? I put a picture up here. This picture was painted like probably 1,500 years after this point in time. And so obviously like the demographics and the culture and the art styles are probably not indicative of first century Judaism. However, I like the looks on these people's faces. The artist did a good job of capturing this, and this was a painting done of this moment. Mary's out of the picture below. I cropped it out because I wanted you to focus on the faces. But as I look into those faces, I think, sometimes that's my face. Sometimes I'm one of those faces. Maybe a lot of times I'm one of those faces. Really? I don't know. What? And different people, there's a different flavor for each face. And none of them are good. None of them are celebratory. None of them are complimentary. And they land on this, you could have sold this for 300 denarii, 300 days' wages, $50,000, and you could have given it to the poor, and you wasted it. Why are these people have spent day in and day out with Jesus for the last 3.5 years. We're 2 days out from his arrest and crucifixion. And the closest 12, the ones that are going to be like the ground zero for the church, are looking at Mary going, you foolish lady. Why are they so mad? Why are they so upset?
Number one, they don't like a woman doing that. Number two, they feel usurped and they're the inner circle and she's just a nobody and she's doing this to Jesus and he's not reprimanding her.
Maybe. Yeah, we don't really get that blank filled in, right? So that's a thought. What else? What do you think? Why? Can you see yourself being angry if somebody just threw $50,000 down the drain?
They don't understand what the future's bringing.
They don't understand what the future's bringing? Okay, yeah, there's a lot of things they don't understand yet. Peter said, I'll die with you, Jesus. I don't think they really believe what Jesus says about him being crucified is actually going to go down, right? What else? Why would they be so mad?
So I think their focus has been for years now to serve people and take care of the poor. So that was maybe where their heads were.
Okay.
That was what should be done with everything that came into the ministry.
Yeah, we've been about taking care of these poor people and healings and all. This has been the last 3.5 years. So this, of course, this is what we should be doing with our resources, right? Yeah, so maybe it's not all poorly motivated. Maybe they just think, this other thing should be the priority.
Human reaction.
human reaction? Yeah, I mean, isn't that us? We just kind of shoot from the hip sometimes, like we wear our emotions on our sleeve, and whatever we feel in the moment, that's what we say and that's what we do. We're not like analyzing ourselves going, is this really a good way to react in the moment? We do that later, but we don't always realize in the moment, right? I mean, maybe some of them are genuinely concerned. Maybe some of their consciences are offended because they really do see it as a waste. Maybe some of them are comparing it, what she did, it's not as worthy as what I would do with the money if I were making the decisions. And I think kind of what it comes down to in the moment, like if we're honest, I think this person used their money in a different way than they should have. Have you ever thought that about anyone else? I think they used their money in a different way than they should have, in a way that's less spiritual than what they should have, in a way that's wasteful, in a way that's not that meaningful to Jesus. I mean, you can fill in the blank with 150,000 things that people spend money and we spend money and your spouse has spent money on, or your friend or your brother or your parents have spent money on that you thought were poor uses of money, right? And then the other wild card in this is the guy who started this argument in the first place, the one who really came down on her heart in the first place. Matthew doesn't tell us this, but when John's writing his gospel story of Jesus' life, he says actually Judas was the instigator. And the reason why Judas was the instigator is because he's the guy that kept the money bag, and he would take money out of the money bag for the poor. And then you realize, there's a whole other level to this too. The guy who got everybody angry at her in the first place wasn't concerned about the poor at all. He just wanted $50,000 in the kitty so he could take out some and skim off the top when nobody was watching. And we know from the end of this how Judas reacts. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And as soon as this instance happened, he's so angry at him not having access to steal part of this $50,000 that he goes and betrays Jesus. And he goes to the leaders and he says, "What will you give me? How much money will you give me if I hand Jesus over to you?" He's just so mad, and he's so money focused, and he's just like they are, and not at all like Jesus' kingdom is focused on. And I think thoughts like, do they even have a right to be angry at this situation? It doesn't really concern them, right? She's not doing anything to harm them. She's not wasting their resources, but somehow they've personalized this and said, I have a right to be mad about the way someone else is using what they have for God. And I think we really have to be careful about that as people, as a church. And that's probably the biggest take-home that I have from this whole conversation and reading this account, is just that we need to be so careful about judging other people's acts of spending, of sacrificing, of worship. I mean, in the practical realm, think about somebody who has, a nice home for entertaining, or who spends money for a nice meal for people. Is that to get attention, or is that because they really love people and they want to sacrifice for people and they're doing this for Jesus in their heart? It's kind of hard to see motives, isn't it? And so we have to be very careful about that. Jesus, to finish off this morning, it says, aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? Bothering is a little light. It's why are you attacking this woman? That's how it literally reads. Why are you attacking her? She has done a beautiful, also the verbiage that Jesus uses indicates that it's a very difficult thing. Giving up $50,000, how many of you would find that easy? I can't imagine a world where I find giving up $50,000 easy. I can't imagine a world where I find giving up $1,000 to be an easy task. But this woman just gave up $50,000 to honor Jesus in a way that was on her heart. She has done a beautiful / difficult thing for me, he says. You always have the poor with you, but you don't always have me. Think about that. That was actually a little bit of a jab to his followers because he's referring them back to Deuteronomy chapter 15, where God outlined a policy to eliminate poverty in Israel. But you see, Israel over the past 1,500 years have been a little too selfish to eradicate poverty. They wanted to keep their stuff and their resources a little bit too much to follow through with God's plan. Jesus is saying, Poverty could not even be an issue if everyone's hearts were in the right place. But there's something bigger here than just giving to the poor. She's doing this for me. This is an act of worship for me. And he mentions that she's anointing his body for burial as well here. And he says in the next verse that people all over the world throughout history will remember what this woman has done here. Throughout the whole world, this story will be told in memory of her. And we're reenacting that right now, halfway around the world from where this story took place 2,000 years ago. And again, that's where Judas says, I've had enough. And he goes and gets his cut because he can't steal it because it's not there to steal. And I just think, what matters most to Jesus? That's a tricky question. It's harder than we would think to come up with an answer for. But I think before we snap to quick judgments on people and how they're using their resources and whether or not it's spiritual enough and whether or not God approves and whether or not their motives are in the right place, we just need to step back, first of all, and evaluate ourselves. What are our motives? And what is Jesus concerned about? Is he concerned with these huge sacrifices that, eradicate poverty around the world? I would say probably. Is he concerned with these huge sacrifices that are just extravagant displays of worship toward him that nobody else understands? I would say probably. Maybe all these things matter to Jesus, and we should be careful about judging too quickly.